World leaders will announce their agendas for solving global crisis during the high-level week of the 78th UN General Assembly. I sat down with the new president of the world body, Dennis Francis, from Trinidad and Tobago, to talk about his theme of peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for the international community. I'm Frank Uciardo, and this is TRT World One-on-One. UN General Assembly President Dennis Francis, thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
Thank you very much for having me.
The agendas that you set out for UNGA 78, tell us about them and whether or not the war in Ukraine or even the coups in Africa are affecting what you're looking to do this year.
The agenda set out for UNGA 78 this year reflects four key dimensions of the challenges being faced today in the international system. You refer to Ukraine and Africa, and those theaters would relate naturally to the issue of peace, which is something that is absolutely required today. You would have heard the phrase and the references that there can be no development without peace and no peace without development, that they are two sides of the same coin. The fact of the matter is that large multitudes of human beings have been stuck in poverty and are experiencing hunger. In 2015, the United Nations all but made a pledge to humanity to do something meaningful to tackle poverty and hunger. But then along came the COVID-19 pandemic with all its impacts on the economy, on employment, on confidence in business. And so people who had been lifted out of poverty and out of hunger in many cases have slipped back down. So that we are now looking at a situation where there are approximately 865 million people living in abject poverty in the world, with hunger approaching the same metric. That is not sustainable. And so the focus of this year's UNGA is to recalibrate and refocus and to turbocharge the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that the UN can deliver for people, to give them a better quality of life.
Mr. President, are you concerned that the anticipated visit of President Zelensky from Ukraine will dominate things so much that it will draw attention away from a lot of the goals that are being discussed?
I do not see President Zelensky's visit dominating the attention of the General Assembly. Ukraine is part of the reality that exists. It's been there for in excess of a year. We had hoped that it would not happen or that it would stop very early, but that has not happened. We have other work to do, and that work will, I'm quite confident, be addressed by the General Assembly with energy and with creativity.
There was an item that came out from the UN a couple of weeks ago that basically said that half of humanity lives in countries that are spending more on debt service than humanitarian needs. How do you tackle that?
It is a big problem. There is a problem of the overhang of debt. I believe approximately 60 or 65 middle-income countries are experiencing debt distress. They've got to go to the markets to borrow, often at extremely high rates. And this creates an overhang of debt which they must then service. Debt service rates are high, And therefore, this problem of being in a vicious circle of debt that absorbs resources that could otherwise be directed to development exists. There has been a call led by the Secretary General of the United Nations and led by developing countries, particularly small island developing states and others, to reform the international financial architecture, to make it easier for developing countries to borrow at reasonable rates vis-a-vis the developed countries, and to ensure, therefore, that development can be financed on reasonable terms for developing countries.
You mentioned the Secretary General just a moment ago. It reminds me that he said that the 2030 goals are possibly slipping out of reach and they may not be able to be recovered. How do you energize the member states during this General Assembly to reach those goals?
The extraordinary thing about the SDGs is that countries must take ownership of the process. In other words, development has to be driven from within. There needs to be an injection of capital from beyond the country, from outside, in order to move the private sector forward. The SDGs are as much about creating dynamic economies and jobs as about creating higher standards of living and welfare. And these projects would be anything. It would be the manufacture of goods and service, or it might be, for example, the development of public infrastructure, things like roads, ports, airports, transportation systems, etc.
I remember listening to a speech of yours in the GA, and you talked about, well, it's a good thing to have all these meetings and events, but you have to have a good outcome.
Well, of course we want a good outcome because people's lives are at stake. Every human being has the right to demand, a job. Jobs give people dignity. They give them hope. And our hope is that the economies will grow on a sustainable basis. So you avoid the cycles of, to the best of your ability, of boom and bust. Boom and bust. Stable long-term growth is much more desirable because that gives people a sense of predictability. Markets love predictability. Investors abhor uncertainty, doubt, confusion, political instability.
In the General Assembly, it seems to me that what is highlighted is what the developing nations needs when it comes to climate change, and that, of course, is the big summit this year, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, you're quite right. Climate change is a huge issue on the agenda. It affects us all countries in the world. But the perverse thing is that it is those that are most vulnerable, the small island developing states, the countries, those that are most vulnerable, who pay the heaviest price due to the impacts of climate change. A formula must be found, a global formula, to ensure that heating of the atmosphere does not exceed 1.5 degrees based on pre-industrial levels. Otherwise, it may well be irreversible. There would be widespread damage to the planetary systems. Ecosystems that are already under stress will fail to function. More flooding, more rainfall, more hurricanes, more earthquakes, more distress, more human suffering, more demand for resources to repair damage done, physical damage done to economies. So we've got to act prudently, sensibly, and in a concerted way, in a collaborative way, as the international community, in order to forestall and to roll back the effects of climate change. And that requires us to make solid decisions based on the fact that our ecosystems have limits and that we have to observe those limits if we have to have a chance of continuing to survive on this planet.
In closing, I wanted to ask you, there must be some degree of personal excitement on your part in anticipating of what's going on during the high-level week for you.
I don't know that excitement captures it. There is, of course, a high degree of unpredictability to it. What I would say is that as a confirmed multilateralist, I value and I appreciate the potential that we have as an international community to take real action that will have impact. We can do it. We've done it in the past when challenged, and I have no doubt we can do it again. It really is a question of the political will to act in a manner that will be responsible and create what we need on this planet. We need to look after the planet and to look after each other better than we've been doing in the last couple of years.
UN General Assembly President Dennis Francis, thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
Thank you very much for having me.